Well, looks like we have some people who want to find out about depression. It seems to me that the main problem involving our emotional tensions at the moment is to consider, if possible, the purpose for which we are in this world. The prevailing attitude is that we are born here to enjoy ourselves, to work as little as possible, be paid as much as the allowances permit, and advance our own personal interests, attitudes, ambitions, and aspirations, with no consideration for each other. It is a rugged individualism which is gradually changing into a ragged individualism. We are asking too much and giving too little to this embodiment. This is not a holiday in this world. We are here to learn, we are here to work, and we're here to gain certain pleasures, joys, and satisfactions and fulfillments as a result of personal effort. All this seems to be contrary to the prevailing temper. Everything today is focused upon exploiting the individual, especially in the area of his luxuries. He is expected to have continually increasing appetites, whether or not he has any means of paying for them. He wants more and more for doing less and less, and almost everyone is geared and keyed to a delusion. This is a delusion to assume that this material existence is here primarily to produce millionaires, to enable us to speculate generously in various commodities, to live beyond our means and never suffer for it, and be continuously dissatisfied with what we have because of pernicious advertising. All in all, we are in trouble, and we have no real answer to the trouble in the form of a general reform in society. The probability of 4 billion people suddenly becoming enlightened and resolved to do the right thing is rather remote, especially when we realize that most of these people do not even speak the same language. Also, their ideas of values are different, and each one has its own peculiar pattern of living. And this goes on and on and on throughout the entire structure of human society. As we look about us for a panacea, for a remedy, we invest in every type of an extravagant political situation that comes along. We are constantly seeking some form of panacea which will cure our ills, but not interfere with our mistakes. Those mistakes are sacred. We not only have a right to them, we will fight to the bitter end to prove that they are correct mistakes. And this in itself becomes a rather painful situation. Looking around us, we observe everywhere that the nervous tensions are rising rapidly. We are less and less organized as persons. Individuals who 10 years ago had a good memory now forget the most common incidents in their lives. Persons who were satisfied with moderate incomes suddenly find moderation to be a penalty. Those who have for generations been grateful to this earth for taking care of them now resent the fact that it cannot provide them with every luxury that they want. As long as we have a mistaken philosophy of life, we are certainly going to be under stress. The human body is a wonderful thermometer. It helps us very clearly and definitely to discover what is wrong with the temperatures within ourselves. And at this time, fatigue, disillusionment, disappointment, fear, anxiety, dread, and almost panic, these forces are working everywhere in our society. If there is any possibility of correcting the situation, it certainly rests with ourselves. We cannot depend upon our neighbors changing. We have no way of assuring that our public officials will reform their ways. We have no reason to hope that business will suddenly become philanthropic. We cannot change anything in this world with certainty except ourselves. And no one can prevent us from changing ourselves if we so desire. The individual who is tired of complaints, who is weary with the body's reactions to pressure, who cannot afford expensive medications, who has tried 16 different diets and is still overweight, all these people have got to sit down and face the facts of life. They have to realize that we have to have our happiness in our own names. We can be as happy as we are intelligent, and we can be as miserable as we are foolish. Now, how are we going to go after this particular problem? There are several different approaches to it, but nearly all depend upon one essential decision or commitment within ourselves. We must have a sincere desire to solve some of the problems that face us as individuals. We must consecrate our lives to getting out of the dilemmas that are destroying health, happiness, and peace of mind. We are only here for a relatively short time, at least in this embodiment, perhaps 80, perhaps 90 years. Maybe occasionally a few extra years thrown in for good measure. But in this span of time, we must make a series of decisions. From the beginning to the end, we must steer our living with intelligence. When intelligence fails, security fails. How are we going to get this intelligence? Well, for a long time we thought we could get it by education, but this is becoming increasingly doubtful. The trouble with education is that it assists us to adjust to what is wrong, but does not attempt to correct the errors. Therefore, education says the world is as it is. Adjust to it or suffer. Therefore, education gives us various instructions on how to make the best of the bad bargain that we call life. It helps us to have a trade or an art, and whenever something new comes along, education works it over until it becomes obsolete. For a long, long time, we have been training people for special fields of activity which generally cease to be important by the time the training is complete. So all these different situations have impelled us to realize that education is not giving us the internal resource necessary to control ourselves. Education will help us to do the best we can as long as we remain inadequate. Education will also try to get us to get our minds off of our troubles by the hope of executive promotion in business. It assumes that if we know enough, study hard enough, and graduate successfully enough, we can live in reasonable comfort during our present embodiment. This is a beautiful thought, but is not supported by common evidence today. The next point that comes along, perhaps, is religion. Religion tries to explain to us that there are values that are more important than material success. This would be more convincing if so many different beliefs were not themselves developing very selfish attitudes and are working for material success. Actually, the primary contribution of religion is to dedicate the individual to principles, to make him understand why he has to keep rules if he wants to be happy. Religion would also offer him the instrument of faith. He would be able to feel that there is a power in nature working on his side as long as he behaves himself. This does affect and does encourage and does help a great many persons. On the other hand, many who try this method become disillusioned because religion does not work miracles in their personal problems. Philosophy would help if there was any, but philosophy is in a very bad condition at the present time. It is very largely merely a matter, as Voltaire pointed out, of individuals throwing stools at each other. The philosophers are all divided into various groups, and most of which are as difficult to reconcile as religious sectarians are. On the other hand, there is something new arriving and arising in the philosophical world, and that is psychology. Now, psychology started out by being a rather bright star of hope, and is still a very important approach to the problems of life. Psychology can, in many instances, demonstrate why the individual is in trouble, but it cannot always persuade him to change his ways. Those who are emotionally and mentally depressed are very much like alcoholics. They know that they are wrong, but they cannot break the negative habits. So we have to face the fact that there is no easy way to break a long-established pattern of attitudes. We begin to develop attitudes when we are children, and by the time we reach middle life, the attitudes control us. We are no longer able to clearly resist the pressure of our own emotional and mental complexes. As a result of this inability to face facts, we go on catering to partly fulfilled ambitions until finally we drift out of this world and all that relates to it, at least temporarily. Out of this world, therefore, is another realm of uncertainties. Many persons who cannot live well here, or do not, have a very strong hope that they will do better after death, that somewhere out there is a reward for all of the suffering they do here. Now, the principle of reward for suffering would be pretty serious and pretty substantial if we were not personally the cause of our own suffering. But this kind of cuts into the idea of universal justice. In other words, heaven is presumed to reward us bountifully for our own mistakes. This is a dubious point of view. If we try hard, we may gain a certain overtone of recognition and reward. But to do nothing and expect to receive universal commendation for it is not reasonable or very practical, and there's no proof that it ever works out. Now, if this is true, and all we can hope for is the courage, strength, and resolution to do what we know we ought to, how are we going to evaluate the situations we find ourselves involved in at the present time? One of the first and most important problems that we all face is the effort in one way or another to live on a pattern or in a pattern with a minimum of stress. It is very important to our health and happiness that we use as little energy as possible repenting our own actions. It is also very important that we should not undertake projects which will destroy us in the hope of some special reward. The person should try to live within his own natural capacities and not be constantly moved by the fact that there are others who are doing better than he is. Various capacities have to be recognized. Many folks will learn to play the piano, but there will not be very many Paderewskis. But you do not have to be a great master of an art in order to enjoy it. You do not have to have either a grand opera or a Nashville rock voice in order to enjoy singing. You can enjoy it by the mere fact that no one ever will hear anyone whose music sounds better than his own. It's the way people think and feel. They enjoy even moderate successes. One way to get out of our stress is to become more pleasant in the presence of moderate successes. That we do the simple things that give simple pleasures and avoid these tremendous activities which are so likely to fall apart. So if we realize that we are all a little different, but that this difference does not make it necessary for us to suffer, we will gain a new perspective on some of our problems. Each person should live within his means, and this does not necessarily simply mean his financial means. It means to live within his capacities, to live on a level in which he can be comfortable, reasonable, and free as far as possible from unnecessary worries and anxieties. Today we have a very serious problem arising that is affecting a great many people, and that is the problem of unemployment. Unemployment is becoming a major disaster, not only in this country, but in most parts of the world. We have reached a point in technology in which we are gradually running ourselves and each other into bankruptcy. We are constantly seeking to broaden the measure of profits and gradually reducing the employable in these various fields. Now, everyone is subject to the danger of one of these problems hitting home. From now on out, the problem of economic security is always going to be a subject of hazard. One day we may succeed, the next day it may take all that we have to survive. We do not know what lies ahead, but we do know that there is grave possibility, at least, that an effort to perpetuate prosperity is going to end in tragedy. Therefore, from the very day in which we first realize this fact, each person should quietly organize his own resources. He should discover what is necessary and what is luxury. And he should realize that nature did not necessarily intend him to be a glamorous personality. If we are still working and we still have some economic security, the situation demands greater thoughtfulness and organization of these resources. Mental, emotional depression are closely related to debt. And the individual who is in debt is in trouble. Ben Franklin pointed that out over 200 years ago. The individual who buys what he doesn't need, either because his neighbor has it, or because it is fashionable, or because it is a luxury and a labor-saving device that is not essentially necessary. People who spend money in this way are apt to regret it. Now, if they are more economical, they may also have a tendency to tip the economic system into a more moderate relationship with the consumer. It is necessary for business to realize that it cannot flourish by making individuals into bankrupts. That when the individual spends more than he can, business itself is ultimately going to suffer. So if we are employed and we have reasonable securities, and we can perhaps feel that we could splurge, this is an excellent time to realize that splurging is not the basis of happiness. It is really something which will only ultimately contribute to worry and anxiety. Now, if the person is not employed at the moment, and therefore has a problem involving labor unions or involving the curtailments and bankruptcies of various corporations, then it is too late to try to prevent the situation. It is then necessary to do whatever can be done to reduce the pressure and to get into as economical a balance as possible. This very often will result in the loss of luxuries. But if it is in the cause of securities, the individual will have less medical bills if he has fewer luxuries. There is no sense in trying to maintain a standard of life which has been taken away. But let us always remember that the standard that has been taken away has nothing to do with the standard of principles within ourselves. A high standard of living depends upon what we are and not upon what we have. And very often a reduction in our luxuries results in an improvement in our integrities. So wherever necessary or possible, the individual should begin to discipline his appetites. And not long ago, a friend of mine took 2 or 3 people to dinner in one of our moderately fashionable restaurants. The dinner for 4 cost him $125. The food value was probably about $7.50. The rest was prestige. Well, prestige is something that the average person today cannot afford. It is not necessary for him to retire to a one-arm lunch counter, but it is necessary to be thoughtful and to curb extravagances. And the person who says, I'm going to be extravagant now because I do not know how long I can keep it up, is foolish. The purpose is to move and smooth out a way of life in which there is the greatest probability of being able to live it the rest of your days. And this means a moderate relationship with life itself. It means an ability to cope with probabilities of difficulty and stress. Actually, the theory we seem to be working from largely today is that our principal legitimate expenditure should be for entertainment. This has resulted, of course, in a measure of entertainment which most persons are having more and more difficulty standing. The entertainment field has catered to the worst, and there is no improvement in sight. Extravagant expenditures for modern entertainment is a complete waste of time. This is another problem that people have to face. They've become so accustomed to these matters that they do not think very much about it if they finally decide they would like to pay $100 a month for X picture channels, or would not object to paying $50 a seat for a theater ticket. This type of thinking is going to result in nervous breakdowns for millions and millions of people. You cannot do it that way without worry. And for the moment or two, an hour or two of pleasure, or what you think is pleasure, you may pay with hours of worry and anxiety when you can't make the car payment. All of these matters mean that organization of yourself, the clear understanding of what you need, what is necessary, and what is proper, these things must be given their proper consideration. There will always be somebody in this world that has a little more worldly goods than we have. But it's not at all certain that that same person doesn't have more worldly worries than we have. Luxury is a lovely thing if you don't mind worrying yourself to death trying to maintain it. There are false values of all kinds that are being heavily rewarded, and individuals are taught to believe that these false values are worth sacrificing integrity to attain. But they're not. And it's becoming increasingly evident that we are on a very dangerous path at the moment. Actually, however, there's one reassuring point. It's not as bad as it seems to be. Because, as one man said years ago, the less we have, the less we can lose. It is the individual with great holdings who has great losses. And these great losses remind me of the fact that I was on Wall Street when the 1929 depressions hit, and I saw a man walk out of the New York Stock Exchange, put a revolver to his head, and blow his brains out. Now, we're not doing it quite that way now, because in some way, perhaps, the way things are now, it would be very hard to hit brains, even with a good shot. The main point is that a quiet approach to life, a moderate approach to life, while it may not be free from all anxieties, reduces them. Reduces them because of the effect it produces in personal living. At that same time in 1929, a number of persons reported that having seen their entire holding wiped out in one day, went home and for the first time in years had a good night's sleep. There was nothing more to worry about. Now, if these persons had been moderate in their investments, wise and thoughtful, had not been over-extravagant in their living, they might have escaped this deluge and have had many good nights' sleep because they were never in danger, or the danger was so slight it was scarcely worth considering. We watch each person as the days go along, and we find the friends and relatives and acquaintances becoming more and more edgy. No one seems to be very happy about anything, and nearly everyone has a pet peeve as to what is wrong. If we get about 500 people together, each with a different peeve, and they all express what their peeve was, the composite result would probably be approximately correct, because there are hundreds of causes for these uncertainties and these unpleasant reactions. The individual has to be careful, however, that he doesn't manufacture difficulties. It's bad enough to face the real ones, but it is even worse to imagine a great number of problems that do not even exist and become frightened to death by the products of your own imagination. Actually, we are all looking for something, someone, that we can blame for this particular problem. Last week I had one envelope come in to me that must have had 50 sheets in it, each containing some definite explanation of who was responsible for everything. It was not only a completely discouraging list, but the question always arose, well, how much fact was there in it? Because actually the various statements were very lightly supported, if at all. For the most part, it was simply blind anxiety blurting out its fears. Well, there is a lot of that these days. Individuals are frightened. Everywhere they turn, they see a conspiracy. Everyone around them is out for something that they have. All around the world, every religion, every political system, every industry, every economy is corrupt and is being used to destroy our peace of mind. It's very, very tragic. But the only answer to it lies in having an indestructible peace of mind. Whatever happens, we will discover, as we have from the past, that the worst does not occur. No matter how much problem and fear and worry we have, or how many conspirators we assume to be hiding somewhere to separate us from a few dollars, the real problem lies still with ourselves, that we cannot afford to develop vast prejudices that divide us socially, religiously, racially, culturally. We cannot afford to look upon everything that is not like ourselves as an enemy. We do not realize the danger of this prejudice problem. And nearly everyone who is unhappy today is pointing an accusing finger at what he regards as the cause of his misery. But up to now, his tendency has been to point his finger in the wrong direction. He should be pointing it at himself. For here is where the real problem has to rest. It is our own ability to integrate our living and our thinking so that we can fulfill the Bible admonition that if we are right, we will survive, and that those who are wrong may fall on both sides of us, but we will still stand. The problem is always that we must be right. And this is the first line of defense against worry, fear, and anxiety. We have to be correct in our own relationships with life. It might seem that this is a very serious frustration, and perhaps it would be a little bit of a frustration if this was the only existence that we have. But whatever we do here is certainly going to go on, and we are going to take with us into something beyond this life most of the pressures that have burdened us here. There is no reason to assume that death changes us. It changes our location, it takes away our body, but there is no way of being sure that it changes any mental or emotional attitudes that we may hold. We will probably go on being ourselves, and that means that unless we have done something to improve ourselves, that if and when the time comes to start another pattern of living, we will bring back nothing but the faults and pressures that we took with us. So we have to, in a long-range thinking, try to make the corrections that are necessary while we are here. If the individual believes that he doesn't come back, it still remains the same problem. If he doesn't come back, it's all the more reason why he should do the best he can here and get as much of real value out of life as is possible. So the nervous person has got to sit down and analyze what is the cause of his nerves. What does he dislike? Who is he jealous of? What person is irritating him? Why does he hold on to ambitions and appetites that are unreasonable? Does he really think that by buying the larger house he's going to be a happier person? Does he really believe that he has to keep up with the Joneses? Does he find it absolutely necessary to make every possible last degree of profit on every transaction that he makes? Is it necessary for him to profit to the point that he prevents other human beings from having the proper necessities of life? All of this selfishness and self-centeredness is contrary to rules. And nature's way of doing things can be summed in the simple thought: if we are not reasonably contented, there's something wrong with us. We like to assume that it's wrong with the system. But the system is nothing but a mass of us. The system is a collective picture of our own personal attitudes on the various responsibilities of living. Out of this also comes a new type of escape mechanism. The individual, not wishing to change himself, has only one way out, and that is to forget himself. Instead of rising above his own weaknesses, he is going to escape from these weaknesses by killing out his own recognition of them. So the person who is nervous or neurotic or depressed goes on to medication. If he is depressed, he may be given a stimulant. If he is overexcited and obviously a paranoid, you can give him one or another form of sedation. Always the idea is not to cure the problem, but to block the symptom. We are supposed to get well by forgetting what we are supposed to do. But instead of having this happen, we finally discover that we are allergic to the medication and ultimately kill ourselves in the effort to avoid thinking. Also, there is the alcoholic. There is all the different type of escape mechanism. We find people who are living in a very unpleasant, unrealistic, and unmoral way simply to escape the problems of life. Another thing that is very important, and I notice a lot of people seem to be struggling with it, and that is, what is the person doing actually to improve his own mental existence? What are his interests? What does he do to make a better life that will solve some of his problems? He comes home. It's been a hard day at the office. Or it's been a hard day somewhere. Or it's been a day in which there was very little work but a lot of anxiety and irritation. So he comes back. What does he do? Turns on the television. And he's going to live with the television and probably get an indigestion from the television dinner. But he is going to watch probably about the lowest level of entertainment that has ever afflicted the American people. He is going to go through all of the murders, all the rape and carnage, all the space wars, all kinds of dramatizations, real or unreal, about all the unpleasant moments of history, and a careful program of destroying and disintegrating the reputations of famous persons. This is entertainment. Or, being a nervous and sensitive man, he might go into rock, which will guarantee that he will be in the jitters for the rest of the evening. Nothing doing. Nothing is happening. Where is any effort to become a better person? The idea is to slowly drift through this life without noticing it more than necessary. The individual makes no effort to make his homes any kind of a place of securities, and if one person tries desperately, the rest of the family is probably against him. Everywhere the emphasis is upon mental indolence and emotional agitations. It's become now almost indispensable to our emotional lives that we watch murder, rape, and carnage. It's the only thing which we react to. Every phase of our life is being slowly lowered by the fact that we have made no demands upon ourselves to the fulfillment of our own resources. We are perfectly willing to drift from here to there without any more thought than is absolutely necessary to get across the street in a heavy traffic hour. Sometimes we don't make that. Now, we have a mind which is supposed to give us all kinds of possible usages. There are many interesting, useful, and valuable things to be known and learned. But the mind has also its own willingness to conform to our prevailing inertia. The mind can be just as lazy as the body. The mind can object to thinking on the grounds that it is fatiguing. I know many people who say they gave up thinking because they couldn't live with their own thoughts. Well, it can be. Because if you use the mind simply, without discipline, without direction, and without motive, it can spend its time wandering through a maze of inertias and inadequacies, which are worse than nothing. But the mind is there, and everyone can grow and use it. And the time spent in using the mind properly can be saved from the complete waste of mental energy and the corresponding danger to the nervous system. The person who is thoughtful is not going to be nearly as panicky as the thoughtless. And the less organization we have, the more subject we are to adverse crises of one kind or another. If we do not run our lives, circumstances will treat us like a heavy storm will treat a small ship. It is up to us to take hold of these things if we expect them to solve problems for us. Now, on the mental level, apart from the emotional pressures, we have all kinds of inducements to poor thinking. Good reading has become a very rare thing. Nearly all the books that we find now popular, the bestsellers, are trivia. They demand nothing and provide some form of more or less transitory and inadequate entertainment. We buy books now because everybody else reads them or because we subscribe to some book club. But most of the books we read are worthless. And it probably is just as well that they won't last very long because they weren't worth anything in the first place. In the past, reading was a great art. Even in the early years of the present century, reading contributed tremendously to many aspects of human character. A wisely selected reading program. Even in the early years of the present century, reading contributed tremendously to many aspects of human character. A wisely selected reading program informs the mind, elevates the thinking, and most of all, educates vocabulary. A person who reads good books has a better control of language and can express his own feelings more adequately as a result of having an adequate vocabulary. The reader also learned to spell and gained discrimination in literature. He became aware of what was a good book and what was not a good book. He also became aware of customs and policies and peoples and ways of life all over the world. He could become almost a universal citizen, reading quietly by the light of a gas mantle on his table. This is practically gone. Reading today is completely trivial in most instances, and more serious reading is devoted almost entirely to some form of skill or scientific knowledge which we hope is going to improve our earning capacity. If we would take 2/3 of the time that we spend listening to bad news on television to a study of the basic literature of the world, a serious study of history, of biography, a serious contemplation of carefully drawn human characters as found in the writings of the great novelists and the great literary geniuses of the 19th century, we would come into a better relationship with life. We would have more tolerance for other people because we would understand other people better. Through Charles Dickens, you could learn to understand a great many people, and in this way also gain a certain tolerance for the idiosyncrasies of persons and realize why each individual is what he is, and not resent constantly the fact he may differ from us in something. Art, music, all of these civilizing forces can be cultivated by discrimination. But if the discrimination is lacking, all these things simply become time killers. And the human being, whether he knows it or not, cannot afford to kill time. It is a very limited resource and is the basis of the personal securities and integrities that he hopes to build. Also in this same problem, the problem of being quiet is a very serious issue at the present time. We live in a world that is full of noise. There's hardly a silent moment anymore. But more than that, we live in a world in which there is a tremendous amount of man-made unnecessary noise. One of the most common forms of this is small talk that leads to nothing. Arguments, dissensions, hatreds, and various accusations that are unfair or unreasonable. Somewhere along the line, the person who wishes to know himself must be able to sit down and become acquainted with himself. To each of us, ourselves remains always the unknown person. We spend very little time trying to understand our own motives. We simply fulfill the pressures. If we don't feel good, we let our bad feelings show. If we're angry, we explode in somebody's face. Nothing is really given any serious consideration under such pressures. So each person, beginning in childhood, should recognize the dignity and importance of quietude. The individual should be able to sit down and simply relax and think. Think without pressure. Think without intensity. Think in fields and areas which are comforting to the mind. Remember the better things of life and gradually discipline and appreciation for the benefits we have enjoyed, and also the gradual integration of patterns to contribute to the happiness and security of other people. A quiet, meditative relationship, a relationship in which peace of mind is the result of relaxing away from the stupidities with which we have become dominated. Everyone should be able to be quiet. It should not be necessary for the person who is not up to his neck in activity to sit back and simply fidget. There is no peace of mind where the individual cannot settle down quietly to contemplate or think or enjoy the benefits of his own spiritual experience and life. It is also through the quietude that we have to approach heaven. For whatever religion we may hold, whatever faith is important to us, we come closest to realities in quietude. And when we get nervous and upset and the blood pressure rises, quietude will bring it down again. Quietude also brings with it patience. The quiet person does not necessarily carry a chip on his shoulder. The quiet person is able to estimate more correctly the attitudes of others. It is much less likely we will misunderstand people if we listen quietly to their words or watch quietly their actions. Very often misunderstanding is simply within ourselves. A prejudice has taken over and we spit back at someone. All these things create sickness. All of these things destroy the benefits of life. Now, with many people, there are two very important emergencies in life which have to be considered. One is the emergency that arises when children leave home. There is always that day when a busy life, made largely busy by the responsibilities of parenthood, this suddenly ceases to be an emergency or a dedication. The birds have flown. The individual suddenly finds a very serious vacuum. He has no longer the responsibilities, the anxieties and worries of parenthood. There is suddenly an empty nest and people who are unable to face it. They do not know what to do with themselves. And very often, the untrained, undisciplined mind has a tendency to sit back and contemplate its own deprivations. Very often it will contemplate why the children shouldn't have married the persons they did marry. Or why have they not continued to write home every day? And why do we only hear from them when they want some money? Why are all these things suddenly brought to our attention, bringing about a feeling that we were never appreciated, that we have been left alone, we have given everything and gotten nothing, and on and on and on and on, until we can dissolve in a noble example of self-pity and go on sedations as the only remedy. Now, lots of people do this. They just cannot face the fact of life as it really is. They cannot say with cheerfulness, I have finished a responsibility and now my life is my own. The reason they do not want a life of their own is because they never had one. They do not realize that maturity implies the need for a personal existence. That things that perhaps were not possible due to the responsibilities of family had to be passed over. But now at middle life, it is possible to pick up all these threads and do interesting and important things. But if the mind simply will not rise to this occasion, then there are all kinds of false activities created, and we never fool ourselves with time-killing diversions. Unless we are really doing something worthwhile, we know it. And at that time, it is very necessary to think seriously of starting a second career or carrying on an early one. If at this time we have some leisure, some freedom from responsibilities, it may be that we should advance our education. But we should certainly do something that is intense enough to get our minds away from ourselves, so that we are no longer neglected parents, but are now adventurers going out in a pattern of personal accomplishments. A number of persons have made wonderful lives by simply picking up important threads when the responsibilities of the family these responsibilities were lightened. Also, do not transfer all of this wasted energy and time on grandchildren. Do not spoil the grandchildren. Do not try to fill in by taking over their lives. Think always in a term of a life of your own. This means that sometimes you may be very helpful to the grandchildren, but do not let them take the place of children as a center of interest and an excuse why you should not do any thinking of your own. Now, the second emergency that comes along is the emergency of retirement. This is sometimes one of the most difficult of all, and probably the difficulty is very largely to be faced by the wife. The man is suddenly home all the time, and it was bad enough when he was home at weekends. Now he is nervous, unsettled, and does not know what to do. He does not know why he is suddenly deprived of all of the original incentives of life, because in the course of his business career, he practically forgot or neglected his own personal survival. He was part of a machine of some kind, and when the machine was turned off, he was left. Now, this in itself is always a matter of concern. A number of persons have found that it was possible for them to develop a third career, or at least a second successful one. There are many persons in their 60s who have suddenly found themselves fulfilling many of the interests and attitudes of earlier life, things that were frustrated or not possible. Many have formed new business projects of their own, have taken up or completed educational practices and policies. They have learned how to make and do various things. They have learned to simplify living, so that having a smaller overhead and a smaller establishment, they are able to have more time to do the things they want to do. Then comes the question, what do they want to do? The answer to that very largely rests with earlier thinking. It's very hard to take that up all by itself at the end. It is much better for the individual to have carried along with his business career some other activity. The businessman and the housewife should have other interests that they have been developing over a period of years, so that the transition from one focal point of activity to another is comparatively slight. If there's no such an adjustment possible, a bewilderment settles in, and in this bewilderment all kinds of false values take over, and the person gradually falls into one form of depression or mental chaos or another because of the lack of focal point. That a person should reach retirement age without a mind sufficiently disciplined to carry him from that point on seems difficult to believe, but it is very, very common. So that the undisciplined retiree falls into small purposes that have no real significance and no actual satisfaction for himself. Here, hobbies can be important, especially if these hobbies have basic educational value. Various projects involving social activity, in teaching and in working with people, all these things can develop into useful extroversions. But most of all, if the person's retiring at 65 or 70 has no interest in life, it is an indictment of his previous living, and it is also a hazard to his survival. A proper planned life after retirement from business can add 10 or 15 healthy years to the life of the person, and can give them an opportunity for mental and emotional maturity that they were deprived of during the long years of business involvements. So here are two periods in which it's very necessary to take over the problems of living and try to plan a successful long-range career. This is something that I think more or less reaches the summation of the situation, and that is the long-range plan for living. Not that the person is to live from now to the next vacation. Not that the person shall live from now until he buys a new car. But a long-range plan based upon a life of expectancy that for us here in the Western world will extend probably to nearly 80 years, and sometimes more. A period of time in which a long-range plan worked on diligently from the beginning and forever in the back of the mind. This is very important. It is this long-range plan, for instance, that comes into the front of the mind when we sit quietly and do not think about transitory things. The long-range plan is something that should be filled with hope, filled with resolution, filled with dedications to various useful, constructive, and unselfish activities. But the plan should be there. And if necessary, when the person graduates from high school, he should begin to think about that plan. He should view it as a basic of his life, that he is a person, is living. He is going to accept the responsibilities of life. He is going to fulfill his responsibilities and his duties. But he is also going to be ever mindful that there is a reason for his existence beyond economics, beyond promotion in office or something of this nature. That there is a reason, and that is that he shall grow, that he shall finish this life a greater person inside himself than he was when he started. This is not a growth of ego satisfaction. This is not the fulfillment of ambition. This is not self-centeredness, but it is a fulfillment of what humanity is assumed to be here for. And that is to grow, to help, to be friendly, to be serviceable, and to be modest in requirements and attitudes. These are the things that should be planned for from the very beginning, so that along with all of the different responsibilities, the person does keep a small, sacred core of intent within himself. That he is not going to sacrifice any responsibility in order to favor himself, but that in the midst of the fulfillment of responsibility, he is also going to realize that there is something inside himself that has to grow, that has to unfold, that has to mature, and that his usefulness to others depends upon the fulfillment of himself in a very large measure. If he can realize this and build accordingly, he will have a much better chance of escaping the doldrums from which we suffer today. We look around on all the levels of life, and these doldrums are closing in. We are frightened, we are worried, we are nervous, we are anxious. But most of all, we lack an internal core of integrities. Yet we have religion, we have enough ethics, enough morality, enough background in common education to tell us that there are certain things we should do. But they take a little effort. And the individual says, I have to work all day, I have to use effort at my job, and when I come home I don't want to work, I want to play. Well, that's all right, but there's no reason why we should not play creatively. There is no reason why our recreation should not be enjoyable and useful at the same time. Because actually the final fulfillment of pleasure is the accomplishment of some kind of good that is going to enhance or increase the value of our participations in life. So that there is no reason why we cannot enjoy growth as well as, or better, than we enjoy escape from labor. Now, in the same problem, we find people in these difficulties are very often inclined to drift along. Now, there's a very narrow line of demarcation between an attitude and an affliction. The individual who holds wrong mental and emotional attitudes long enough will finally develop a chronic form which may progress into something extremely undesirable. The individual will no longer worry because he feels he has something to worry about. He will worry because he can't help worrying. The problem is no longer important. It is becoming a mechanical process. Also, a neurotic gradually can drift into a psychotic. The moment we begin to develop wrong attitudes, we begin to endanger not only peace of mind, but health of mind. We become very close, perhaps, to mental disease. But the same is true of emotional disease. Very many people who in one period or another in life fall into the problem of a psychosis are persons who from the beginning of life never controlled themselves. They are persons who from the beginning had certain attitudes which were difficult. Most children growing up have at least one difficult attitude somewhere in their makeup. If this is not worked with, if not corrected, if no one does anything about the difficult attitude, it may linger and never appear in any major way, but it may, under adversity, come out with a torrent of pressures. The child who has always been dictatorial can become a dictatorial adult. A dictatorial adult will always finally face another dictator stronger than he is, and the result will be a collapse. We cannot allow any undisciplined attitude to take over. We have all kinds of beliefs, but these beliefs finally become finalities. You take a person who is very worrisome on some subject, and you say to that person, what is the foundation for your worry? What have you in the form of evidence, actual evidence, to support your anxiety? And very often the person has no direct answer. He's worrying because everybody's worried. He's worrying because the world's in a mess and everyone knows it. And he goes on with these generalities. But he does not have any clear indication or any clear process to explain his own attitude. It's just a generality depending largely upon the conduct of other persons. So under these circumstances, it is very important that the person shall take over an attitude the moment he finds it arising within himself. One of the simplest attitudes that we have to work with is prejudice. Now, to many people, prejudice is loyalty. Prejudice is necessary because it belongs to the group, or it belongs to the family, or it belongs to the theological structure to which the person belongs. Prejudice is therefore something which is very hard to cope with, but prejudice nearly always ends in trouble. Prejudice opens the person to every type of negative propaganda that can be launched against him by society. Prejudice destroys peace of mind and cuts him off very often from important, useful, and friendly people. Prejudice can affect the fate of his children. It can affect everything, his job, and everything that relates to his life. If he becomes locked in the concept that every dog is like the dog that bit him, he's in a bad way. There is no possible way in which prejudice can end in anything except sickness, because health depends upon seeing good in everything, and sickness is seeing evil in everything. And the more evil we see, the sicker we become, and the quicker we come in contact with good that is appreciable to us, the quicker we begin a recovery. So we watch prejudice, and it's very scarce to find anyone who isn't involved in it in some way. The most common prejudices are religious and racial, but national, political, industrial, economic, educational, medical, all different fields are burdened with prejudice. And nearly every case, prejudice is a mistake. Now, that does not mean that the person has to become an easy believer, but rather that he must develop a discrimination that enables him to dissect and detect that which is proper and useful, without generalizing on a situation in which generalities are too abstract and uncertain. Now, another problem involved is not only in prejudice, is ambition. Many persons are born Napoleons, and most of them end in Waterloo. Many people are quite convinced that by some circumstance beyond their own control, they are formed of a superior material. There was a special quality used in assembling their personalities. They will never be able to just simply be people, because they were born to rule, to lead. Now, these people are, my observation is that many of these people are about the most unfit persons I've ever known. Instead of this prejudice being an expression of a great capacity, it is simply pure egotism. They are simply self-centered and overwhelm everything around them with the importance of their own attitudes, which are not important usually. And as a result of this, a great many of these highly ambitious people become utterly frustrated. They will never be satisfied with moderate success or moderate achievement. They must go on and on to the domination of society. People of the caliber of Hitler, Mussolini, Napoleon are examples of this tremendous drive, which ends in tragedy to themselves and disaster to the world. Therefore, the individual must be very reasonable in his ambitions. You should have ambitions which are largely aspirations. You should have the aspiration to become a better person. You should have an ambition to do your job well. You have a right to assume a reasonable advancement. But the idea that you are destiny's darling is going to cause trouble in most cases. The individual is frustrated and finally very often psychotic. And this moves often into the religious field, and the individual believes in a special dispensation that has been granted to him. And as a result, he becomes a nuisance to others and a disaster to himself. These things have to be watched, but the mind must be the sentinel. It must stand ever ready to evaluate things. It must judge, it must confer evidence, proper decision. It must work out all these problems fairly and reasonably. That's what it is for. When we do not use it in that way, we get ourselves into constant difficulties. Emotional intensity is also very often a matter of frustration. And in this field, affections are a very definite factor. People like to believe that they know what love is. Well, love is a very mysterious thing. People have been trying to find a definition for it from the beginning of time. And I believe, if I remember correctly, it was Voltaire who said on one occasion that the best definition he knew was that love was an itch in the heart where it can't be scratched. But very few people can really give us a mature definition of love. Love is usually, as St. Francis de Assisi pointed out, is the bestowing of an affection, not the demand for it. The individual who gives an honest affection fulfills love in the best possible way. But the individual who loves himself better than the persons around him, and who is always finally in love with his own interests, his own attitudes, and his own emotions, can be a very sad character in the course of life. Love is something that requires a great deal of thought, or it can ultimately lead to the greatest despair, to emotional and mental distress that is almost beyond calculation. Love brings with it suspicion, which is very serious. It brings with it jealousy. All kinds of negative emotions and attitudes spring up. And everything then depends upon the internal adjustment of the emotions. Love asks nothing and gives all. And when it begins to ask a lot and give little, it has ceased to be a normal affection. And the individual who believes that normalcy requires jealousy or hatred is simply wrong. Love is a fulfillment. It is an ennoblement. It is a dedication of self to the service of something greater than self. Love of God is the service of that which is the supreme greatness. Love of religion, in the sense of our Christian faith or any other religion, is that a love is strong enough to make a dedication of service, that it is strong enough to cause us to change ourselves for the good of others. And where this type of emotion exists, you can work with it. But where love is a constant self-centeredness, we have people all the time who have had a disappointment in love, and 50 years later the embitterment continues. Everything in life has been ruined by the infidelity of a person. Everything has been made terrible because we have a thankless child. All kinds of attitudes contribute to a gradual development of neurosis, in which we do not realize that the entire emotion of love is controllable by ourselves, and that it is controlled best when it gives most and demands least. If we can also then transmute problems, we are in a better way toward solution. Wherever a difficulty arises, it can be transformed from a disaster into an achievement. It is very definitely true that everything that hurts us most has a lesson that will make us better. We will find that in the meeting and mastering of circumstances, we gain the greatest consolation in the world. The person who has a right to be happy, and is really happy, is not the one who has never had tragedy, but one who has transmuted tragedy into soul power. Tragedy should make us greater, make us deeper, wiser, more loving, more understanding. Then it is a contribution to our good. If it ends only in embitterment, we have lost everything. So inside of our own natures, we have to sometimes, some way, evolve an understanding of the values that are emotional and mental sources of security. We all have a right to be thoughtful. We all have a right to have certain minor anxieties if need arises. But we should always have an anxiety that is pointed toward a solution. Whenever a problem arises in our lives, our first reaction should definitely be, what does this problem mean to me, and how can it make me a better person? If we can always think this way, we're not going to become neurotics. We are only going to become neurotic if we believe that experience is unfair. But actually, what we think is unfair is challenge. We are here to grow. If we grow, we are happy. If we resist growth and fight against it, then misery sets in. So it's always best to try to transmute and transform negative aspects of personal attitudes into constructive ones by a simple action of the will. No great big fight, no tremendous struggle against everything that is inside of us, but simply a realization that we're here to learn, that if we can learn happily, we will be happy. If we cannot learn happily, we will be unhappy. But regardless of our attitudes, nature says we will ultimately learn. So it is best to do it joyfully in the first place. Now, there are times when it's not going to be easy, but if we are really sincere people, if our religion is more than simply a creedal denomination, if we really believe in the integrities of life, if we actually feel convinced in ourselves that we are part of a benevolent plan ruled over by an all-divine power, then we can take these problems and work with them. And by working with them in a reasonable manner, solve them. And by solving them immediately as they arise, we can go through life without scar tissue in the subconscious. We can go through life without developing a series of mental and emotional infirmities which will become worse as we grow older, when we will have ever greater need for peace of mind. We can have it if we earn it. But as the Arabian Nights said, their happiness must be earned. The individual to be happy must keep the rules. The individual to be healthy must obey the laws. And a person who allows his mind or emotions to go to seed is bound to have trouble. But knowing this and realizing it, and knowing that we are equipped to combat this situation, and that there is always within us the power to transcend any debility that we may manifest, it is perfectly possible for us to day by day make those improvements in our own living by which we will prevent the closing in of this pressure of pain, psychological misery, mental headaches, and the resulting disabilities. Every attitude relates to some function of the body. There is something in us, an organ, a muscle, a nerve, a gland, an artery, or a vein, that particularly reacts to any mental or emotional excess that we have. Each one of our attitudes is symbolically represented in a body function. If these attitudes, therefore, become sick, the corresponding body function will be debilitated. And whatever attitude is not according to natural law, which affects our mental and emotional living, also affects our health, and gradually tears down our physical resistance. Therefore, it's not necessary just physically exercise in order to keep well. Jogging will not solve the emotional, mental problems. But mental and emotional jogging, an effort to exercise the faculties and emotions constructively, will help us to maintain health. The body will take care of itself reasonably well if the mind and emotions do not sicken it. So if there's anything wrong in the body, try, at first at least, to work with the emotions and mental attitudes. And if it's no longer possible to prevent the situation, then realize the tremendous dynamic advantage of adjusting to it constructively, idealistically, and hopefully, with strong faith and optimism concerning the immutability of growth in nature, and that in the end all things will come out well. Well, time's up, folks.